let's make our wrist pin cushion together. I've gathered my materials. I have this fabric. I have my piece of leather. This is the pattern that I used for the leather that I cut out. I have button and elastic. My elastic's about 8 inches long. And I have some stuffing, then of course hand sewing needles and thread. So first thing we got to do is cut out our fabric. We need a rectangle that is 5 by 12 inches. All right, so I'm going to use this notebook as a straight edge, and I will mark. All right, so that's a straightish line. Now I'm going to measure down from that 5 inches, set my seam gauge at the 5-inch mark, and measure down 5 inches. Okay. I'm going to connect those lines together. And I'll make a line on this side. And then we have to measure up 12 inches this way. So I'll get my tape. And we'll connect those dots together. All right, so there's my piece I'm going to cut out. All right, so I have cut out my piece, 5 by 12 inches. You'll notice that this is a directional print. Directional meaning it has a direction to it. All my flowers right now are pointed up. If I turn it the other way, then all my flowers will be upside down. So I want to make sure when I'm working with this that the bottom of the flower, this is the bottom of my project, this is the top of my project. So first thing we have to do is turn under 1/4 inch on each long side and press it. So that's what we'll do first. So I have right side facing down. I'm going to turn up 1/4 inch and press. This 1/4 inch doesn't have to be exact, so you don't have to measure it with your seam gauge if you don't want to. But it should be pretty close to 1/4 inch. Okay, next we're going to form a circle, put right sides together, placing the short ends together, and we're gonna open up the folds that we pressed in for now, and then sew straight across the short end with our running stitch. So I pressed the folds in preparation for future use, but for now we are gonna open up those folds that we put in, and we're going to sew along this edge. I like to do one back stitch at the beginning to kind of hold it in place, and then with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, do your running stitch. Stitches should not be more than a 1/4 inch long. Don't pull too tight. an extra stitch at the top, around the top, to lock that in place. Knot it. Now I'm going to go over to the iron and press that seam allowance to the side. Notice that I just left my thread attached. I didn't cut it because now I'm going to go back and I'm going to top stitch right along here, going through the seam allowance. So I'm going to stitch that seam allowance into place. Let's look at our instructions. So we completed this step. Now, around the base of the pincushion, we're going to put a running stitch through our seam allowance that we pressed in the first step. Alright, so my thread is still attached. And fortunately it is at the base, so I'm just going to keep using it and do my running stitch all the way around. So you see the running stitch on the outside and the running stitch on the inside. It's going through the seam allowance. And I'm going to take the running stitch all the way around the base, and I'm going to pull it up, gather it up tight to form this circle. Okay? Okay, so we've gathered up the base. You want to pull it real tight, and I like to kind of pull each side in a little bit, maybe kind of sew like an X shape into it, and my thread is getting short now, so I'll have to tie a knot and let that be it. While we're hand sewing, I thought I'd talk about a few tips for hand sewing. One is the amount of thread that you are using. It really should only be as long as from your fingertip down to your elbow. So the length of thread that you're using should not be overly long. If it is very long, you're gonna tend to get more knots in your thread and it's gonna be harder to sew with. The other thing is that when they make thread is actually twisted when they make it. So when you thread your needle, you can kind of feel as you run your fingers along that the threads might twist around each other. That will also tend to give you knots when you're trying to sew. So what I like to do when I thread my needle, I actually like to separate these two threads out and then run them between my fingers like that a few times. That helps get the knots or the twist out of the thread, which will prevent your knots. So that's how I like to do it when I first thread a needle. So now what we need to do is put in our leather base and then stuff it with our polyfill. So here's my pincushion so far. And here's my leather base. It has a hole in the middle. We want to match up this hole with the gathered up hole. Okay, those two should line up together, and then that should fit inside pretty nicely. The leather is not necessary. You don't need the leather, but it is gonna keep the needles, when you're using your pincushion later on, is gonna keep the needles from poking through into your wrist. If you don't have leather, you could also use a piece of cardboard. That's pretty easy to come by. Or you can just be careful how you poke your pins in, not poke them straight, but poke them in through the side, and then you'll miss your wrist that way too. So leather is optional, but it's a nice touch. And we have it, so let's use it. And here's our stuffing. Stuff it up. I like to put a couple handfuls in and press it down. And you can kind of pull that over to see if that's going to be enough. And I think that's pretty good. I think that's going to be good. So now we take our needle and thread, and we're going to do the running stitch around the top now. Alright, so now we cinch it up tight, and I'm poking my stuffing inside. If you feel like you need more stuffing, now's your chance. It's going to be squished a little bit, but if you feel like you want it a little puffier, go ahead and put more stuffing in now. And then once you feel like it's good, we'll need to sew it up tight, which is a little tricky. But do some whip stitching across the top. And once you feel that like that's pretty secure, tie your knot and cut it off. Alright, so we did our leather base, we did the polyfill, we gathered the top and sewed it all together. So mine looks like that. And let's see what's next. Sew on the button. So for the button, we're going to be sewing a button to the top of the pincushion, like so. And it's going to be positioned on the top. It's going to cover up this gathered circle. We're going to need to use a needle that can fit through the thickness of that. So you're going to need a pretty long needle to get through there. And remember the hole in the middle of the leather. We're going to need to aim our needle down through to hit that hole. Otherwise we're not going to be able to get through that leather. Also, we need to use thread that's a little bit stronger than just your regular all-purpose thread. I'm afraid all-purpose thread, because you're pulling on it to, when you put the button on, you squish it down, so it'll be cute. But that puts a lot of strain on your thread, and regular thread will break. At least it broke on me when I was doing this before. So I'm gonna find some little bit thicker thread, maybe a nylon thread, or There's a button and craft thread you can use, or quilting thread is stronger, or jeans thread, or top stitching thread. There are a lot of different threads that are just a little bit thicker and stronger that we can use. So find a length of that and we'll sew our button on. All right, so quickly here are some threads that you could use. Here's a regular thread that we've been using for sewing. You can see it's pretty thin. This is a top stitching thread that you use for jeans, so that's definitely thicker. This is a button and craft. It says craft and button on the end. You can buy that at Walmart, Joann's, places like that. This is quilting thread. It is also very thin, but it's very strong. So you could use that. And then this is a nylon thread that's used like for furniture and car repair, like upholstery stuff. So any of those should work fine. All right, so I chose my nylon thread to use. And I am going to start by sewing an X in the base to anchor my thread there. So this is my bottom. So I'm going to hide my knot on the inside, hopefully. And sew an X into the space. Uh-oh, it's a little hard to work with. Okay, then I'm gonna tie a little knot here. Okay, so I got thread in my base. Now I'm gonna go up through this gather part, through that hole in my leather, up to the top. My needle come out of the top. And I'm going to put my button on. You can either sew your button on with 2 parallel lines, or you can do an X. I think I'm going to go for the X option. Having trouble getting through the leather hole. There we go. This is a bit fiddly because you have to find the holes in your button, but take your time. Squeeze it up tight every time. If you need to push the end of the needle on the table, get it through, go ahead. If you just can't find your hole, you can put your needle up in between there. Where's my needle? There it is. And then get your needle up behind your button and then stick it up through the hole. All right, so I think that is pretty good. My button feels tight. I don't think it's gonna fall off. So I'm gonna say that's enough and tie my thread in the back. And I'm going to put the needle inside to hide my thread tail. All right, great. So we have a button on our pincushion. Now we need to create our elastic loop. So we take our elastic. You're gonna put it around your wrist, like so. If you have a friend who can help you, it might be good. And you want it snug, you don't want it loose. If it's loose, then your pincushion's gonna be falling all over the place. So you want it not tight, but snug. And so that's the amount that you want to overlap the ends, and you're gonna whip stitch the sides together. I'm going to pinch that, take it off my hand, and I'm going to stick a pin in it to hold it in place. All right, now we're going to whip stitch these sides. All right, so I have whip stitched around this connection with my elastic, and I just went back to using my regular thread for this part, and then the last part we have is just connecting these two together. So I'm going to place this on where I want it, covering up that gathered circle, and I'm going to whip stitch along this edge and along this other edge. I'm just going to use my regular thread again. The elastic to the wristband. I did whip stitch this end, but did not whip stitch this end. I think it's gonna be okay. I don't think it's gonna come off. So that's good. Put it on. And let's use our pincushion. Yay!